Okay. Um, you got your stuff out. I'd like to go over some of the notes. If you look at the whiteboard, you'll notice that the carbon stuff is gone, but I left the nitrogen cycled up there, and I've added one last little layer of color. We'll come back to that. Number 19, you should have already copied all of that. I'd like to use your study guide to talk about 19, 20, and 21 quickly. That'll wrap up assignment 2.3. Then we'll shift gears to assignment 2.4, which is your reader questions. Um, in number 19, what sorts of organisms are responsible for converting molecular nitrogen into its useful forms? Remember that that's all bacteria. All reactions are made by bacteria. Plants absorb ammonium and make that into amino acids, but all of the other chemical changes are done by bacteria. This is why we say that the nitrogen cycle is primarily driven by life. There's no rock cycle dissolving into water sort of stuff. It's either in the atmosphere, so it's just chilling as gas, or all the other transformations are part of the basic day-to-day metabolism of bacteria. You drew the graphic already, so I think we're done with number 19. In number 20, it says answer a few questions. How does molecular nitrogen enter the cycle? Remember that molecular nitrogen is the gas. So that enters the cycle, that comes into play when bacteria have fixed that nitrogen. Nitrogen fixation is when you make it into ammonium. Now it can be used by plants. Nitrogen gas, not useful to plants. Ammonium is useful to plants. Next question, what are other sources of ammonium? I think we went over this in most of my periods on Tuesday, but just in case, ammonium comes from two separate sources of bacterial reactions. It comes from nitrogen fixation, which is gas made into ammonium by nitrogen fixers. And ammonium also decomposes out of animal waste, where amino acids are broken down back into ammonium in the process of ammonification. You can probably see that on the diagram. Nitrogen is used by living things to make proteins, and that also includes DNA. And it gets back into the atmosphere when denitrifying bacteria digest nitrate and split out the oxygens to make nitrogen gas, which comes fumbling out of soil because gases rise out of soil when that soil is disturbed. That should be it for nitrogen. I hope that made sense to everyone. I will offer Mr. Archuleta or my TAs the option of pausing if my students have questions that the other students could answer. So if any student has a question, raise your hand, see if any other students can answer it. Presumably you would have paused if you needed it, so I'm going to move on. In study goal number 21, there's a few questions about phosphorus, and I said, don't copy the graphic, instead answer some questions. How is phosphorus different from carbon and nitrogen? What role does it play in terrestrial ecosystems? How does it get onto land? And after it's washed down to sea, how does it get back to land? This is probably something that you've noticed if you did your homework, and if not, you can probably scribble this down really quickly. Phosphorus has no gas phase. Write that down, no gas phase. That's important. Because if it's in rock, it can only leave the rocks by weathering, where rainfall washes that phosphorus into dissolved phosphate in water. Then that can enter life. It can go into producers who fix it into plant material. Then plants can be eaten by you and me and other organisms, and those other organisms can eat each other. It can stay in the biosphere. So I could die, you could die, the dog could die, the tree could die, all that stuff decomposes, makes dirt, the dirt makes more producers. And so it can stay in play, it can cycle biotically. through consumption and decomposition. The biotic phosphorus cycle is consumption and decomposition. But here's the catch. Because phosphorus has no gas phase, phosphorus can essentially only move downhill with biological cycling, but eventually downhill. It's in a rock, and so it's going to dissolve, and now water only goes downhill. It can get into life and get into life and get into life, and it can get into the plant that gets into the cricket, that gets into the frog, that gets into the snake, that gets into the wolf, that gets into the ground, and so it keeps going downhill with the water, washing it, washing it, washing it, washing it, washing it. In the ocean, it can get cycled in life, so it can go into algae, and then into plankton, and then into little bugs, and then into smaller fish, and then the medium fish, and then a big fish, and then huge fish. But for the most part, any time that biology isn't holding the phosphorus, any time that the phosphorus is not in a biotic organism, that phosphorus must be moving downhill because it doesn't have a gas phase. It only has water. It can only dissolve in water, so it's only going downhill. Essentially, you can imagine all the phosphorus starts at the top of a mountain, gets weathered out. Gravity will carry that phosphorus downhill, downhill, downhill. It'll get a bump from life, and then it's downhill, downhill, downhill. It'll get a bump into the biosphere, and then it washes downhill, downhill, downhill. Then it'll go into the ocean, and then it just keeps sinking downhill, downhill, downhill into the biosphere in the ocean, and then it keeps going downhill, downhill. Because it doesn't have a gas phase. It's either in life or it's moving downhill with water, gravity. Eventually you get sediments. If that phosphorus isn't captured into life at the bottom of the ocean, sooner or later, sediment, 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 and you start building rock again. Now it's going to be another, 3, 4, 500 million years before that rock is back on the surface to weather. Because there's no gas phase, there's no rapid part of the cycle. It's either moving from rock back to rock, or it's temporarily in use by the biosphere until it eventually leaks out of the biosphere in water downhill to the bottom of the ocean and make rock again. That's really unique. In terrestrial ecosystems, phosphorus is really important. Use it for ATP. Those are the compounds that carry energy inside of cellular reactions. All life needs phosphorus. I believe phosphorus also has a role in DNA. And I think it might have another, I don't know, whatever. It's used in chemical compounds. I'm sure you have your notes. But it's either weathering out of rocks, downhill in water, trapped in life for however many laps it can stay in the biosphere. But sooner or later, when some little organic material gets covered in sediment, booyah, back to rock. There's a neat little detail. It can leave the ocean and stay in the biosphere because there's birds that eat fish. So maybe you know that there used to be bird guano mined to make fertilizer. I'm almost done. Phosphorus. Down. Maybe it can even come out of the ocean in the biosphere because then it gets into a bird and then crap and then it dissolves and goes back. So downhill, downhill. So interestingly, we could run out of phosphorus. Here's a fun fact. Write this down. It's called peak phosphorus. You've heard of peak oil, the idea that sooner or later petroleum is going to run out. We'll reach a point where petroleum productivity has to eventually go downhill. I mean, I don't know if we're there or not. You can debate that, but sooner or later we would obviously run out. Peak petroleum sooner or later has to happen. So what about peak phosphorus? We got all these rocks. We can grind up the rocks and take out the phosphorus, but sooner or later, when we've used up all the available rocks, it's going to be a long time before we get new rocks, 3, 4, 500 million years. In the meantime, we're going to live in an environment where we can't find any more extra phosphorus. And that's one of the 3 big fertilizers, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. So sketchy thing is phosphorus can only move downhill. We can try to take it out of the rocks and use it up, and then sooner or later we lose track of it, and biology, geology, it becomes rocks. We're going to have to wait a long time once we use up our readily available phosphorus. Best estimates I've heard, 300 to 400 years. But sooner or later, we would be running out of phosphorus. Okay, I hope that wasn't too depressing. We should be done with assignment 2.3. We'll be back to do the reading packet. That's your assignment 2.4. You probably want to have your reading packet out too. Be right back.